Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin, sallallahu wasallam wa barak ala Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Tayyib. So before we start, I want to mention that when I first came here the first time in 2015, and the Imam, Jazakallah khair, he encouraged me to do some teaching. So the first thing I wanted to teach was Kitab, at-Tawheed. I told him. And he discouraged me. He said, I don't think you should start with that. Gave me his reasons for it. And I told him why I really felt I should do it. And so I started with it. And I did a few weeks of it. And I seemed to be talking over the head of the audience. And I felt really bad about that and ultimately changed the work that we were studying. We studied a much more pedestrian work, if you will. And then we went from there and studied a bunch of different books. But this is such an important topic, I wanted to revisit it. And we've been studying for a long time together. And so I thought now was a good time for us to study it. But I felt like last week, and as much as I tried to make it a point as I was preparing for the series, I'm not going to make the same mistakes this time that I made the last time. I felt like last week I had in my mind we're going to do a two-part introduction. And as a consequence of setting a time, I felt like I was rushing and not giving you guys enough time to really understand fully the concepts of what we're saying. And understand the concepts is so critical to once we get to the work, it'll make it so much easier to understand if we really have a good grasp of the concepts. So what we're going to do today, and you saw, many of you who are with us on WhatsApp would have saw the study guide and the review guide, is we're going to kind of review and revisit and make sure that we're all marching together and make sure that everything was clear, and then we'll continue and pick up from there. And we'll continue in this way going forward to make sure that the concepts, because the introduction is so critical because it'll make the study of the book so much easier if we really have a good grasp of the concepts. So with that said, last week we started out, or let's look at what we're going to try to look at today. So first of all, we're going to review what we covered last week was at-Tawheed why and at-Tawheed what. I'm going to try to review that and have a very clear understanding of that. Then hopefully today we'll begin the categories of at-Tawheed. If time allows, we'll also talk about the distinguishing or how do we distinguish the types of at-Tawheed, one from the other. And last but not least, what is worship, defining worship Islamically. Tayyib. So now, last week we talked about what makes this topic particularly worthy of study. And we mentioned that it is the most fundamental and important Islamic tenet. And then we mentioned a reason or reasoning or rationale behind that, as well as some supporting evidence. Anybody remember anything from that? That first part? We said it was the most fundamental and important Islamic tenet. We study it because it is the most important aspect of Islam, the most important tenet of Islam. We supported that with a rationale, and then we supported that rationale with evidence. Anybody remember? At-Fadl Ahmed.
If you are not on good basis with that, all your deeds are not accepted.
Ahsant. That basically at-Tawheed is the key to salvation. If you have at-Tawheed and you are lacking and deficient in other aspects of Islam, irrespective of their importance, doesn't diminish their importance, but those aspects of Islam, you can be saved, you can achieve salvation without them if you have at-Tawheed. But the opposite is not the case. You could have the best prayer, you could have the best character, you could be the most generous person, you could fight and die in the way of Allah. But if you don't have at-Tawheed, none of that will matter. None of that will have any value. And one of the proofs that we gave to support that was from Surah Al-Zumar, the 39th chapter of the Quran, verse number 65. where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ أُوحِيَ إِلَيْكَ وَإِلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكَ لَإِنْ أَشْرَكْتَ لَيَحْبَطَنَّ عَمَلُكَ وَلَتَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. Allah says, it has already been revealed to you, Muhammad, as it was revealed to those who came before you, the prophets from before, that if you associate partners with Allah, if you violate a Tawheed, if you're void of a Tawheed, then your deeds will be null and vain. They'll be nullified. And in the hereafter, you'll be from the losers. We also mentioned the hadith about Muslim on the Adi bin Hatim, which is the hadith where the Prophet mentioned that the first people who will be judged on the day of resurrection, will be a martyr, a scholar who learned the religion and mastered the Quran and taught it to others, and a wealthy philanthropist who spent in every path from the paths of Allah. They'll all be brought before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He will say, because they did all these deeds ostentatiously, He'll ask them about these bounties He gave them and what they did with them, and they'll say that we did this for your sake, and we did that for your sake, and Allah will say, كَذَبْتَ. You did it so it will be said, brave. You did it so it will be said, qari'. You did it so it will be said, kareem. And then He'll order all the good deeds that they did, all the piety that they demonstrated. In spite of all of it, Allah will order that they be dragged in their faces and thrown into the hellfire. All those good deeds did them no good because they lacked what? At-Tawheed. On the other side of the coin, we have the famous hadith. We didn't mention this last week, but it's important to mention it now. The hadith authentically narrated where the Prophet ﷺ, he said that there will be a man on the day of judgment who will be brought in front of the khalaiq, brought in front of what? Everybody. And this man will have scrolls of deeds, 99 of them, which will be stretched out as far as the eyes can see, and all of them will be evil deeds. It's called the hadith, the scholars call it the hadith al-bitaqa, the hadith of the card. So the man will have these scrolls of deeds stretched out as far as the eye can see, all of them evil deeds. Allah will say, are these your deeds? And he will say, yes, I can't deny them. Allah will say, have my scribes, the angels who write down the deeds, have they lied? Have they written something inaccurately or attributed something to you that you didn't do? He said, no. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say, do you have any good deeds? The man will say, no. Allah will say, this is a day upon which no injustice will be done to anyone. You do have good deeds, and bring it forward. He will order that it be brought forward. And the angels will bring a bitaqa, a card. And on it will be written that the man said sincerely in his life, La ilaha illallah. He was a person of a Tawheed. In spite of all these evil deeds, he was a believer and an observer of the oneness of Allah. So Allah will say, He will order, or before Allah orders that the deeds be weighed, the man will say, oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what is this bitaqa going to do if it's weighed against all of these evil deeds? Allah will repeat, this is a day upon which no injustice will be done to anyone, and He will order that the deeds be weighed. So that bitaqa will be put in one pan, and those evil deeds will be put in the other pan. And that la ilaha illallah will outweigh the evil deeds. Shows you that if a person has a Tawheed, that's the key to his salvation. Irrespective of what type of Muslim he was, if he really was a person who understood this concept and tried to observe it in his life, it's the key to his salvation. But if the opposite is the case, a person could do all types of pious deeds and be so pious and righteous and upright and do all these virtuous things. If he doesn't have a Tawheed, Allah says, your deeds will be null and void. All that good will be null and void. You'll be from the losers. We mentioned another reason why this topic is worthy of studying. That's to revisit. It's important for us to revisit the religious fundamentals. So we said that this Tawheed is the most important fundamental, and generally speaking, it's important for the Muslims to prioritize the fundamentals. Why? Because Allah prioritizes them. The fundamentals are the first things we're asked about. Is Salah a fundamental? Absolutely. What's the first thing you'll be asked about on the day of resurrection? Your salat. Is at-Tawheed a fundamental? Absolutely. What's the first thing you'll be asked about in the grave? Man Rabbuk, who's your Lord? At-Tawheed. You guys see that? So we need to be intimately familiar with these fundamentals because they're the things that Allah prioritizes, so we need to prioritize it. The third reason we said is because this fundamental is currently under siege. And we spent some time on this last week, and I'd like to revisit it because I want to make sure that it was 100% clear what we were saying here. So we talked about how right now there are a lot of people. At-Tawheed is not under siege by the non-Muslims. There are people who are Muslims. Not just Muslims, but people who are considered people of scholarship. People who are evangelicals, Muslim evangelicals. They are active in the field of da'wah. And they belittle the importance of at-Tawheed. They actively attack, vilify, and discredit the people who prioritize at-Tawheed. And they actively misrepresent at-Tawheed. And we gave an example of one of those shubuhat that is commonly, that is being propagated right now. And that was this one. Calling on the dead and asking them for material or spiritual needs is not a violation of at-Tawheed or an act of shirk, unless the supplicant believes that they have, the person that they're calling on, has godlike powers or takes him as a deity. And they mentioned, to support what they said, the Prophet said in the hadith called Bukhari Muslim, on the authority of Umar, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَىٰ. Actions are but by intentions, and every person will be rewarded according to his intention. So the question that we had was, well, how do we answer that? Because one of the reasons why we're here is because we need to have a thorough understanding of Tawheed to the point where when people say things and they promote these misconceptions, these spacious arguments, these dubious assertions about a Tawheed, we recognize them for what they are, shubuhat. And we're not only that we recognize them, but we're able to formulate within ourselves a response. And if necessary, we're able to articulate that response. So, how do we respond to this shubha? The response to this shubha is min jihatain. It's from two angles. And those two angles have to do with the two things that the person asserts. One, he says, you can worship, you can call upon a deceased person in their grave, for example. You wouldn't be worshiping them unless A, you thought they had godlike powers, or B, you consider them, while you're calling upon them, a deity. So let's answer the first one. Godlike powers. We said we only ask someone if we believe they have the power to do what we ask. That's the first thing. I want you to think about this. Let's say, for example, I have a potted plant right here. A potted plant. I say, it's dark in here. Turn the lights on. I call upon the potted plant to do what? To make the lights turn on. I would say that a person who does that, one of three things is true. One, the person has some mental incapacity. Two, the person is just joking. He's being funny. Or three, they actually believe that the plant can answer and do what they ask. Do you guys agree? Is there a fourth possibility? Or do you agree with that? I agree. The people who call upon the deceased, do you think they're joking? The people who call upon the deceased, do you think they're mentally, they're at a mental disadvantage or they have a mental incapacity? So then the only thing is left, they actually believe that the people in the grave can answer, respond to their request. Now, what's the implication of that? If they believe they have the power to do what they ask, ask yourself, how exactly will that deceased person fulfill their request? Let's say, for example, a person fell into a well and there was no way for them to get out of the well. And they've been calling for hours for someone, help, help, nobody's coming. Person, maybe when they fell in the well, they broke their leg. And they're afraid that if I don't get out of this well, I'm going to die in this well. So they start calling out upon someone and saying, oh, saint so-and-so. Hey, oh, saint such and such. How exactly will the deceased person in their grave, how will the deceased person in their grave fulfill their request? If they're deceased in their grave, maybe they're in their grave for tens of years, hundreds of years, decomposed. This person believes that the person in the grave, how will they do it? Will they be able to get out of the grave and physically get them out of the well? That would mean that they would have to believe, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, if you see it a different way. They would have to believe that that person in the grave can either speak what they want into existence and say, be, and it is. Or will it into existence. That they just want it to happen, and by wanting it to happen, it happens. Would you guys agree with that? They would have to think that. Now the ability to say be and it is that a godlike power or no? That implies that the person calls upon someone who's deceased in their grave, expecting them to do something, and they have no direct contact between them and the thing that they're asking them to do. It means that they believe that they have, by their actions clearly indicate that they believe they have godlike powers, because how are they going to respond? Other than by what? Speaking it into existence or willing it into existence, which is a godlike power. How exactly will a deceased person not in our immediate proximity hear our supplication? That person's in that well and he calls out, "Oh Sayyid Fulan, oh Sheikh Fulan, oh Sayyida Fulan." So the person calls out, and the person they're calling on is someone who is buried far away from where they are. So by calling upon them, what's the implication? What's the implication if you call upon someone, that they can hear you? But they're far away from you. Who's the only one who has the ability to hear a sound regardless of its proximity or its distance? So if you believe that somebody has the ability, regardless of how far away you are from them, to hear you, what have you given them? A godlike power. You guys see that? طيب, ممتاز. طيب, let's go to the next one. He said, share with us, Sheikh Muhammad, share with us, please. Serious, no, if there's an issue.
No, we're good.
Because we want to go khutwa with everybody.
No.
Is there a hole in the argument?
No, we're good.
طيب, alhamdulillah. طيب, number 2. He said that if you call upon somebody in a grave and you don't believe that they're a deity, then you haven't worshipped them. You haven't committed shirk. You haven't done that. You have to believe that they're a deity. You have to intend for them to be a deity. You have to intend to worship them, because the Prophet said, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَىٰ. Actions are but by intentions, and every person shall have for his actions precisely what he intended. And we said the answer for that can be found clearly in the hadith of Adi. But maybe we didn't explain the hadith of Adi and how it proves this point. We didn't do that well last week. Inshallah, we're going to do a better job of it today. So let's look at it together. You guys remember the hadith of Adi, right? It was in I hope it was in your review guide, right? The hadith of Adi. The hadith of Adi, I'm going to summarize it for you. He came and met the Prophet ﷺ. And when he came upon the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet was reciting from Surah at-Tawbah. And he reached the 31st verse of Surah at-Tawbah, the 9th chapter. And that's where Allah says, اتَّخَذُوا أَحْبَارَهُمْ وَرُهْبَانَهُمْ أَرْبَابًا مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ وَالْمَسِيحَ ابْنَ مَرْيَمَ. He said, they have taken their rabbis and their monks as gods besides Allah. Here, when he says arbab, he means aliha or ma'budat. He means gods, deities. And we know this, as you're going to see from the hadith of Adi. When Adi heard that, he said, لَسْنَا نَعْبُدُهُمْ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. He said, Allah is saying that we worship them. We didn't worship them. That's not what happened. So the Prophet said, ألا يحرمون ما أحل الله فتحرمونه ويحلون ما حرم الله فتحلونه. He said, didn't they make illegal what Allah made legal, and so you legalized it? And didn't they make illegal what Allah made legal and you declared it forbidden? And didn't they make lawful what Allah forbade and you made it lawful? You accepted what they said and you obeyed them in that. He said, Bala. He said, absolutely. He said, فَتِلْكَ عِبَادَتُهُمْ. He said, in this way, you worship them. Let's look at that hadith together now. Allah says the Jews and Christians took their rabbis and priests as deities besides Allah. Allah accused them of a what? A shirk. Accused them, asserts they committed shirk. With who? With their priests and rabbis. They took them as deities besides Allah. Adi contended that they had not worshipped their rabbis and priests. What does that mean? In his mind, did he worship? Were they guilty of shirk? No. In his mind, they weren't guilty of shirk. They hadn't committed shirk. No shirk had been committed. So that means that if he had committed shirk, did he intend to do it? No. He didn't intend to do it. As far as he was concerned, it hadn't happened in the first place. Is everybody with me there? Mumtaz. Tayyib. The Prophet then asked, he said, okay, you said it didn't happen. Well, did this happen? The Prophet said, well, did this happen? Did you and your fellow Christians obey your priests absolutely? What do we mean by absolutely? Obeying absolutely. We mean that when the obedience of Allah and the obedience of their priests and rabbis became irreconcilable, they had to choose. Which one did they prioritize? They prioritized the obedience of their priests and rabbis. The absolute prioritization of obedience belongs to who? So that's an act of worship of Allah, is to prioritize His obedience over all others. So the Prophet said, did you prioritize their obedience over the obedience of Allah? He said, absolutely, right? He acknowledged that his fellow Christians, he and his fellow Christians would obey their priests and follow them when they legalized the unlawful and prohibited the unlawful. Absolutely, we did that. We certainly did that, O Messenger of Allah. But he still contends, but we didn't commit shirk. So then the Prophet said, when they did this, they were guilty of worshiping them, even though they didn't what? Regardless of whether you intended to do so, what you did is shirk. Allah is right and you are what? You're wrong, right? In this way, the Prophet is indicating that whenever anything which is the exclusive right of Allah, is offered or attributed to other than Allah, a shirk has been committed regardless of what? The intention. Tayyib. That being said, the act is shirk. What about the actor? Is the actor a mushrik?
No.
Not necessarily. But the act is what? Shirk. Mumtaz. Tayyib. Now let's circle back now. So we return to the shubha and how this hadith refutes the shubha. The person said, if you call upon the dead, you ask them for your material, spiritual needs, then you're only worshiping them if you believe they have godlike powers or you take them as a deity. The response, ad-du'a, is an act of worship? Is it an act of worship or not? Yes. So when you offer that act of worship to other than Allah, what are you doing? You're offering something which is exclusive to Allah, to other than Allah, and that is a shirk. And so in this way, regardless of the niyyah, the act itself, offering something exclusive to Allah, to other than Allah, is a shirk. The act is what? Shirk. The actor, maybe, maybe not. Is that clear to everyone? Is there anyone who did not understand that? Don't be shy. Anybody who didn't understand that? Totally clear? Mumtaz. Then after that, we defined at-Tawheed lughatan wa istilahan, or shar'an. We defined it linguistically and Islamically. Anybody remember what the definition in the language was? Ahsan, to make something singular or one. It comes from the verb wahada yuwahidu, to make something singular or to make it one. طيب ثم بعد ذلك, we mentioned the definition Islamically. And I remember last week when we said, okay, after we did this and we came back, we circled back and we said, okay, what's the meaning of Tawheed? Some people said the oneness of Allah. And some people said worshiping Allah alone. These definitions are deficient. And the reason why we say they're deficient is because they're not comprehensive enough. They're not precise enough. If you were to ask a Christian right now, do you believe in the oneness of God? Is your religion a monotheistic religion? They would say what? Yes. We're one of the few monotheistic faiths. But they believe in the what? In the Trinity. So in their mind, believing the Trinity doesn't contradict monotheism. They believe in the oneness of God, but they also believe that Allah is one and three at the same time. So oneness just doesn't get it because oneness does not necessarily articulate the scope of the very strict monotheism that is a Tawheed, the Islamic monotheism, which is distinctively different from the other claims of the claimed monotheistic religions. Also, if you look at other faiths, they'll say that they're monotheistic, but they have, for example, saints or rival gods. They say, for example, God is the supreme God, but there are other gods who are what? Junior gods. Again, that's not sufficient. And so in Islam, what we say is, at-Tawheed is ifradullahi bi kulli ma yakhtassu bihi. It is making Allah the sole recipient of everything which is exclusive to Him. This is the ta'rif. And this is the one that we have to stick to and understand and really internalize. Because as we're going to see, this is the one that really expresses the extent, the breadth of a Tawheed. It's not just about not worshiping other than Allah. It's about not giving to others and besides Allah that which is exclusively the right of Allah. طيب. How would you respond to this shubha? This is another misconception that we saw. It's common and it's something that we tried to respond to last week. People say that the word Tawheed is what? It's something new. It's a bid'ah. And we gave 5 answers to that. Anybody want to give me one of them? Tafadhal, Mustafa.
The scholars,
it was used by the Prophet. You remember the hadith at all? You don't have to remember the hadith, but do you remember the hadith? So, they say it's a bid'ah, it wasn't something used by Allah in the Quran or by the Prophet in the Sunnah. That's wrong. It was mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ in the hadith collected by Tirmidhi on the authority of Jabir. يُعَذَّبُ نَاسٌ تفضل أحمد. ممتاز. He said يُعَذَّبْ نَاسٌ مِنْ أَهْلِ التَّوْحِيدِ فِي النَّارِ حَتَّى يَكُونُوا فِيهَا حُمَمًا. أحسنت. You got the meaning. Alhamdulillah. Good. The Prophet said in the hadith collected by Tirmidhi on the authority of Jabir, he said, some people from the people of at-Tawheed will be punished in the hellfire until they become therein like burnt pieces of coal. Right? The Prophet said, use the word what? At-Tawheed in this hadith. That's one. Give me another one. Who can give me another response?
Concept in the Quran.
The concept is in the Quran. That Allah might have mentioned the word of Tawheed in the Quran, but He mentioned the concept, His oneness repeatedly. So for example, we mentioned قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Say He is Allah the One. Also Allah says, تفضل. وَإِلَهُكُمْ إِلَهٌ وَاحِدٌ. That's from Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 163. We also have Surah Al-Ma'idah, which is I think verse 83. Allah says, لَقَدْ كَفَرَ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ ثَالِثُ الثَّلَاثَةِ وَمَا مِنْ إِلَهٍ إِلَّا إِلَهٌ وَاحِدٌ. He says, they have disbelieved, those who say Allah is the third of 3, or the third of a trinity. And there's no God except what? Except one God, right? So the concept is in the Quran, even though the word Tawheed hasn't been mentioned, but it's been mentioned by who? The Prophet, which is sufficient. We mentioned 3 other responses. Anybody remember? Used by the scholars throughout history. And we mentioned as early as the 300s after Hijrah, they were writing books and entitling them Kitab, at-Tawheed without anybody objecting to it. So for example, Ibn Khuzaymah, he has a book called Kitab at-Tawheed. He died 311. Ibn Manda, 395. He has a book called Kitab at-Tawheed. Nobody's saying, oh, what's this term? We never heard of it before. Right? It was also mentioned by who? Who's after the Prophet? Ashab Rasulullah. It was mentioned by Ibn Abbas. كل العبادة في القرآن فهو التوحيد. He said every mention of ibadah in the Quran is at-Tawheed. It's a reference to at-Tawheed. And Jabir, when he described the Prophet's Hajj, his farewell pilgrimage, he said the Prophet got on his mount, he made it stand up erect, and then he ahalla bit-Tawheed. He declared Allah's Tawheed and said, Labbaik Allahumma labbaik, labbaik la sharika laka, labbaik. Right? Used by him to describe the Prophet's talbiyah. Ahalla bit-Tawheed. And then last but not least, is that it? The Prophet also mentioned what? He mentioned the verb, which is the root of, or the basis for the verbal noun at-Tawheed. In the hadith collected by Bukhari, on the authority of Ibn Abbas, that when the Prophet was sending Mu'adh to Yemen, he told him, he said, إِنَّكَ تَأْتِي قَوْمًا أَهْلَ الْكِتَابِ فَلِيكُنْ أَوَّلَ مَا تَدْعُوهُمْ إِلَيْهِ أَنْ يُوَحِّدُوا اللَّهَ ta'ala. Let the first thing you call them to be, these people from, these Christians you're going to go to in Yemen, let the first thing you call them to be that they make Allah one. So he mentioned the verbal noun. It's like if I say running and you say he ran, right? Are we saying something different? We're saying the same thing, right? So we have those 5 responses. Here they are. The word has appeared in the hadith. Somebody says it never appeared in the hadith. It has appeared in the hadith. Do your research. In addition to using the actual word, the Prophet used the verb form of the verbal noun. The word of Tawheed was used by the Prophet's companions. وَيَكْفِينَا. The Prophet's companions are more than enough. They are authorities in the deen. If they say something about the deen, it can't be wrong, especially if the others hear about it and don't disapprove. The concept. Doesn't matter what we call it. The concept is in the Quran. In fact, the concept is the Quran. As Ibn al-Qayyim said. He said every ayah in the Quran is what? It's an expression or articulation of Allah's Tawheed. But last but not least, the scholars have used it throughout history without bidun nakir, without any contending voices being raised. Now we get to something new. Any questions about what we covered so far? Any questions? Everything clear? Clearer than last week, inshallah. And inshallah, we'll proceed like this moving forward. Let's look at the 3 categories of at-Tawheed. At-Tawheed, there are 3 categories. And that again underscores how precise the Islamic monotheism is. It's not like the other religions. It's very precise. It's very detailed. And if we understand it correctly, we will create a fortress which protects us from falling into a shirk. The first category is Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. Monotheism in Allah's Lordship, and we're going to talk about what that means. So the first one is Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. Second one is Tawheed al-Asma' was-Sifat. Monotheism in Allah's names and attributes, and we're going to talk about specifically what that means. And last but not least, Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, and it's also called Tawheed al-Ibadah. Monotheism in devotional acts which are the exclusive right of Allah. Let's look at this Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. Let's look at it more closely. Put it under the microscope. The monotheism of Allah's Lordship, what do we mean by that? It's Tawheed Allahi bi-af'ali, or Ifradullahi bi-af'ali. Ifradullahi bi-af'ali. Monotheism related to Allah's actions, which are exclusive to Him. If you were going to underscore anything in that line, Allah's actions. When we talk about al-Rububiyyah, we're talking about the things that Allah does, and only He does. So for example, and we're going to give more examples later, but for example, if somebody said that Allah is the one who rules, yahkum, that would fall under Tawheed what? Tawheed what? Rububiyyah, because that's something He does. He rules. No, he rules. Like he's the lawgiver. And he passes the judgments and rules. That's what? Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. طيب. So anything that Allah does falls under this Tawheed. Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. طيب. So let's do this together for a second. What are some of the, so we'll do 5 more minutes, inshallah. What are some actions which are exclusive to Allah, acts that cannot be performed by anyone besides Him? When you think about that, what comes to mind? Fadal.
Being everywhere.
Being everywhere? Being everywhere? Is Allah everywhere? Everywhere by His knowledge? Everywhere by His support and His aid for the believers? But not everywhere physically. Not everywhere physically. Give me another action that Allah does. Ahsant, He gives life. Somebody said, He creates from nothing. Right. He creates. If you ask them who created the heavens and the earth, they will say, Allah. Right? So creation, He gives life. If He gives life, He also does what? He takes life. He causes death. What else? Okay, all-knowing, mumtaz. Okay, He knows everything. Knowing is one of His actions, but knowing, okay, we'll take it. All-knowing. Ar-rizq, He provides for us. He provides for us. Anything else that you guys can think of? What about decree, divine decree? Decreeing what will happen in the future, right? That's one of His actions, isn't it? Mumtaz. Let's look at some specific examples. Giving life, we heard that one. Causing death, we heard that one. Granting an-nafa' wad-durr. Granting advantage and prosperity. Who does that? Can anybody else do that? Independent of Allah? No way. Willing detriment, ad-durr. Creating a cause and effect relationship between things. I'm going to explain that and talk about that in detail. Creating a cause and effect relationship between things. Willing the outcomes, talked about that, a decree. Predetermining what will happen in the future. So willing the outcome means determining what will happen, predetermining what will happen in the future, pretty much the same. And then affecting objects without any direct contact with the object. Affecting objects without any direct contact with the object. These are just some of the things that Allah does that only He can do. So let's look more closely at number 5. Creating a cause and effect relationship between things. طيب. I want to ask you guys a question. Fire. Fire, Allah has created a cause and effect relationship between it and other objects it comes in contact with. Is that not so? So one of the effects of fire is it can do what? It can give off what? Heat. It can warm you up. Is that not so? Another effect of fire is what? You can use it to what? To cook and warm things. Allah created this cause and effect relationship between fire and objects. It can cook them. It can also do what? It can burn things. It can actually burn things. But that cause and effect relationship between fire and the objects it comes in contact with, is that something that fire does independent of Allah? Or by Allah's will and allowing it to be the case? Mumtaz. And we know this because Allah tells us in the Quran that Abraham's people, they became upset with him when he smashed their idols. And they said, we're going to throw you in the fire for this. We're going to punish you by burning you in fire. And they built this huge fire, inferno. To the point that some of the scholars said that it was so hot, they couldn't get close enough to it to throw him in. So they put him on a catapult and launched him into the fire. Tayyib. When he went into the fire, did it burn him? No. Allah said, Kuni ya nar, bardan wa salaman ala Ibrahim. O fire, be cool and calm for Abraham. Didn't burn him. Shows you that the cause and effect relationship is from who? From Allah. But why is it significant? Because one of the ways that people make a shirk is by giving a cause and effect relationship to things which Allah has not given a cause and effect relationship. For example, at-Tawheed, charms, amulets. People walking around with rabbit's feet, rubbing them. Talking about feel lucky today. What are they doing? They feel like this charm can give them what? Can give them what? They've created a cause and effect relationship between this lucky charm and whatever outcome they seek. Similarly, a person may wear, for example, a special band and believe that this band will protect him from what? From the evil eye, protect him from some type of disease. And it happened in the time of the Prophet, as we'll see in the book of Kitab, at-Tawheed, where they create this cause and effect relationship between the band and what? Something that they feared. And the Prophet called that what? A shirk. And this is something that a lot of Muslims do this without realizing it's what? It's shirk. Person will hang something in their on their rear view mirror. It's not Quran. It's not a dua from the Prophet. It's just something. It may actually be like a wolf's tooth or something like that. And you ask, okay, that's nice, man. Where do you get that from? He said, oh, this is a protection, man. This will protect this vehicle that we're driving in from some harm. What have they just done? Why? Because they did what? Created a cause and effect relationship between one thing and another. Whose exclusive right is that? Allah. And if you give that right to other than Allah, what have you done? Did you prostrate to something? Did you call upon something?
No.
How can it be shirk? Because shirk is not just worshipping other than Allah. That's why we don't say the oneness of God or worshipping Allah alone. We say ifrad Allahi bima yakhtassu bihi. Making Allah the exclusive recipient of everything which is exclusive to Him, which includes what? Creating a cause and effect relationship between things. You guys see that? So we'll talk more about this last example, affecting objects without any direct contact, next week, and then we'll go on to the other categories, to explain them in detail as we did with ar-rububiyyah. Any questions, comments, or critiques? Tafadhal, Shaykh.
So on number 2, on the left,
So
this says things that are exclusive to Allah. So I can shoot somebody in the head and I'll cause their death.
Will you?
Yes.
Have you caused their death independent of Allah's will? You shoot them in the head. Can you guarantee that they'll die?
I chop their head off.
You chop their head off. Can you guarantee they'll die?
Yes.
Yeah.
No. They won't die, just like the fire didn't burn Ibrahim. You see that? That you can do whatever you want, but they won't die unless Allah wills it. And so, He's the one who causes death. Even in the Quran, Allah says, all right, He said, أَلَمْ تَرَ إِلَى الَّذِي حَاجَ إِبْرَاهِيمَ فِي رَبِّهِ أَنْ آتَاهُ اللَّهُ الْمُلْكَ. Have you not seen the one who argued with Abraham regarding his Lord because Allah had given him what? Sovereignty. Gave him like a kingdom and made him powerful. قَالَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ رَبِّي الَّذِي يُحْيِي وَيُمِيتُ. He said, my Lord is the one who what? Gives life and causes death. So the king, he said, أَنَا أُحْيِي وَأُمِيتُ. So he called 2 people that he had in prison. And he pardoned one of them. He said, look, I've given him life. And he brought the other one and ordered his deputy to cut off his head. See, I gave him death. It's like, in his mind, if I kill someone, I've caused him to die. No, Allah, that's what Abraham was trying to say. Allah is ultimately the one who gives life and causes death, meaning if Allah wills for someone to live, they will live no matter what people try to do to them. And if He wants them to die, they will die no matter what. So when Abraham was saying, Allah gives life and causes death, that's what he meant. And the king thought, well, yeah, if I shoot them or if I have them killed, I'm giving them death. No, you are not the real sabab. You're not the real cause. The cause is the will of Allah. You see the difference, Habib?
Right.
Boy and the King.
Boy and the King's another one.
Yeah, they went to throw him off the cliff. The winds.
Couldn't do it. Can't kill unless Allah wills.
Okay, Okay, so back before this one here, you said like one of the exclusive
Yeah.
things of Allah is like, being a ruler. Like we have rulers nowadays.
Hey.
So like being a ruler is not something exclusive to being.
No, ruling in the sense that he issues the rules that everybody is supposed to follow. And he is the real king that everybody has to obey. He allows people in this world to disobey him for a wisdom that is with him. But he is, at the end of the day, he's the real ruler of the world. And that's why on the day of judgment he comes and he says, as the Prophet said in the hadith, he said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grasp the heavens and the earth in one hand. And he'll say, Ana al-Malik, Ana al-Jabbar, Ayn al-Jabbarun, Ayn al-Mutakabbirun. He'll say, I am the king. Where are the tyrants? Where are the big shots? Where are they now? And Allah calls the day of judgment Yawm ad-Din. He says he refers to himself as Malik. He says Malik Yawm ad-Din, right? The king of the day of judgment. Although he's the king of every day. Why? Because this is the day when his being the king, the absolute authority will be apparent to everyone and no one will deny it. Because when he says, where are the kings? Where are the tyrants? Where are the big shots? No one will say anything. And he'll say, Liman mulkul yawm. He'll say, to whom is the real sovereignty al-yawm, this day? And nobody will say anything. And he'll say, Lillahi al-wahid al-qahar. To Allah, the one who what? Who puts everything else what? Down. So I say all this to say is that when we talk about Allah being the ruler, we mean the ruler independent of anyone else. The ruler who his ruling is never superseded and is never frustrated by anyone else. Because even the rulers of today, when they want something done, it's only done if Allah wills it to be done. Whereas Allah is the one who, whatever he wills to be done, it will be done. So he's the true ruler in that sense. That's what we mean. Yeah. And then what we mean also by that is that when we are given a tashri'ah, we're given a law from Allah, we're obligated to rule by that law. As he says, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمْ الْكَافِرُونَ. He says, and whoever doesn't rule by what Allah has revealed, then they are the disbelievers. Then he goes on to say, al-zalimun, they are the oppressors or the wrongdoers. And he goes on to say, al-fasiqun, those people are wicked. Because why? Depending on what motivates them not to rule by what Allah has revealed, will determine whether they are disbelievers or oppressors or wrongdoers or sinners. So that, like I said, the others can rule as long as they rule by what? By what Allah has revealed, and their rule is what? It's governed or it is superseded by the rule of Allah. It's when they step outside of that it becomes what? It becomes actually like shirk. Fine. Any other questions? Tafadali. Wa alaikum salam.
And getting back to the brother that he asked a question about, say you chop off someone's head and they die. Would that be a part of Allah's decree, for instance? And when it comes to like a miracle, for instance, if he didn't make the swing, but for some reason he missed the person, would that be considered a miracle?
Not necessarily a miracle, it's just Allah didn't will. It's just like a person shoots somebody in the head and they live. That's an example, that's a clear example that it's not, we're not the one determining. Because we typically would think, if you shoot someone in the head, they're going to die, and they don't die because it wasn't Allah's will. It can't happen except by Allah's will. He's the one who ultimately will determine who lives and who dies. But any other questions?
Yeah.
Tafadhal, Sheikh.
So you're talking about having stuff for protection or putting a band or whatever. I don't want to jump to that, but isn't that like a tawheed, uluhiyya, not uluhiyya? Because your uluhiyya is like the further af'al al-abd with the actions of the person. The action of the person, right? I don't want to confuse people.
No, what you're saying is right as far as the meaning of Tawheed al-Ilahiyya or Tawheed al-Ibadah. But if a person takes a charm or an amulet or some type of object and they say that this will protect me, it's shirk in Tawheed Rububiyyah, because what they've done is they've created this cause and effect relationship between that object. But if they offered an act of devotion specific to Allah, to that object, then it becomes a violation of Tawheed and Ilahiyya or Ibadah. So how would you, what action have they offered to the band or the amulet that would make you say it's Tawheed and Ibadah? What act of worship have they offered to it?
Yeah, they say that it protects them.
Okay.
It's kind of like
So it protects them. Who protects?
the thing, right?
Okay. But who really protects?
Yeah. It's the same thing like
Wait. Habba. So who really protects?
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Mumtaz. Protecting, is that an action of Allah or an action of al-ibad?
Protecting is an
Action of Allah. So I'm giving that action to the object. Again, ar-rububiyyah. Mm-hmm.
The recitation of it is, I'm not saying it's correct, I'm saying the argument that I've heard people make that it's Quran, so it's like associated.
How? But the Quran is min sifatihi.
But they're using it in the same way if you recite ayat al-Kursi,
Uh-huh.
and there's protection associated with it, if you just act the conflict of it, they'll use that same concept for the animal.
Okay. Two things. One is that, well, a few things. One, Ayatul Kursi is from the Quran. And the Quran is from the speech of Allah. Is that not so? The Quran is the speech of Allah. We all agree on that?
Yeah.
The speech of Allah is from His what? His sifat. It's from His qualities. It's part of Allah. So how can we associate part of Allah with Allah? It is Allah. You get what I'm trying to say? So that's the first thing. Second thing is that Ayatul Kursi is something which the Prophet legislated for us. It can't be compared with something, it would be a false analogy to compare it with something that he didn't legislate, like a charm or an amulet. Number three, Ayatul Kursi is from the deen. It's from the Quran, it's from the deen. It would be a false analogy to make an analogy between it and something which is not from the deen. And then last but not least, the amulet, we have no basis whatsoever to say that it can protect us. But we do have the Prophet telling us that if we recite Ayatul Kursi, it's different because it's legislated, whereas the amulet is not legislated. You see how it's different? So if a person made that analogy, and they could make that, they might make it, we would say it's a false analogy, and this is why. 1, 2, 3, 4. Make sense?
You know, if an amulet has a surah, ayat, ayats and stuff around your neck.
Okay, there's a chapter, because I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. There's a chapter in Kitab, at-Tawheed, the chapter of charms and amulets. And they talk about this issue. Is an amulet from the Quran an exception to the rule? They talk about that. So we'll talk about that when we get to the book. But do we understand about amulets which are not from the Quran? Everybody understand that? Mumtaz, do you understand, Sheikh Muhammad, how if the amulet it falls into shirk for rububiyyah, not al-ibadah? Any other questions or comments? I didn't start out with this, but I'll finish with thank you all for at-Tawheed, Sheikh.
6 and 7, are they basically the same thing, knowing the outcome?
Yeah, I don't know what happened there, Akhi. It's just the same thing being said a different way, isn't it? Yeah, I'm sorry about that. And I didn't mean to, I didn't realize it until we started reading the slides together. I'm sorry, but that's right, you're right. Tayyib, I didn't say it.
If you're about to end the class, I have one here. I just didn't want to prolong it. So back when it goes to like the worshiping of the dead people and whatnot, and attributing things to them. Because this may be something, like you said, it may be a form of shirk, but you may not realize it when you're doing it. Somebody, like if you're talking to somebody that's in a coma, You're not worshipful. You're not asking them to do anything, but you're talking to them, or sometimes, you may go to a grave of somebody that may passed, long time ago or last week, whatever. You're not necessarily asking them for something, but you're talking to them. Almost like, I don't know if you want to call it mourning or healing or, guess what happened last week. And you're standing at the grave like talking to this person. They don't hear you or anything, so is this falling in the same thing here?
The scholars of Islam, it's a very good question. Scholars of Islam, I'll try to answer it quickly, and maybe we can go in more detail next week. But I'll say this. Scholars of Islam differ about the deceased. Do they hear or not? And there are three opinions. First opinion, they hear absolutely. And they hear indefinitely. They absolutely hear and they hear indefinitely. There's no restriction to that. The second opinion is they hear certain things. For example, they hear the footsteps of the people leaving the grave after their burial. And they hear those who give them the salams when they enter the graveyard. As the Prophet taught us to say, when we enter the graveyard, to give the greetings to those who are those believers who are buried in the grave. And they hear a few other things specifically mentioned in the Quran or the Sunnah. And the last opinion is that they don't hear at all. They don't hear anything. But the evidence seems to indicate that they do hear. As Allah says in the Quran and the Prophet mentioned in the Sunnah, specific instances where what? The people in the grave heard. And we'll actually bring those nusus next week. So they do hear you. But the difference between going to the grave and saying, for example, to your loved one, I miss you. Life isn't the same without you. You're just like talking to them. There's a difference between that and going to the grave and asking them for something, a talab. Like, will you do this for me? That's when it becomes what? A shirk. But just speaking to them and believing that they hear, that belief is supported by ayat Quraniyah and ahadith Nabawiyyah. It's supported by some verse from the Quran and from some ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And so the first two opinions are more correct than the opinion that says, more supported and based, founded in the text than the opinion that says they don't hear. And of the first two opinions, the best one, Allah knows best, is that they hear certain things. That they hear certain things. And Allah knows best. And like I said, we'll dig that out, dig the more detailed response out, and we'll bring it inshallah next week. Inshallah ta'ala. Again, thank you all for coming. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak Muhammad.